Very good. And I would ask you one more time if it's okay if we record the session. Oh, you all did that so well. Um, with that, I think I am going to toss things to Sarah to introduce our evening.
Thanks, Gordon. Well, we are just so pleased to have folks from the Congregational Library here with us this evening as our work as associations draws to a close and we begin the combination into the Granite State Association. We know one of the things that has to happen is the turning over of lots and lots of records. And we know that across the board, these are in different places, in different formats, hither and yon. And so we thought it would be really, really important to have Kyle and Zachary here to tell us what are the things that we need to be aware of as we go through these files. We know a lot of these will end up at the conference office, but some of them might be of use to our friends at the Congregational Library. And so how can we weed through things to get that knowledge to be able to get things in the right places, keep the things that need to be kept, and discard what doesn't. And so thank you. We are so appreciative to both of you for being here, and we're excited to really continue this collaboration between the New Hampshire Conference and the Congregational Library. So I'll turn it over to you guys. Thank you so much.
Great. Well, thanks so much for the invitation. Nice to see some familiar faces and also some new faces. So I'm Kyle Roberts. I'm the Executive Director of the Congregational Library and Archives, and we are located at 14 Beacon Street in Boston, and we've been there for a very long time. I've been collecting materials during that time. Zachary Bodner is our archivist, one of our two, and one of the two faces of our church stewardship initiative. I'm not sure if any of you had a chance to see that, but this is kind of a Cliff Notes version of that program today, and customized really to get you on the path towards figuring out what records to keep, what records to toss, when to make more effort to find things, and when to let the trail go cold. So we have a slideshow. Will probably be probably 20, 25 minutes. I think both Zachary and I are very happy for you all to interrupt. This is for your benefit. So raise your virtual hand or unmute and throw out those questions. We've been doing this for a couple of years, but there are always new questions that we're excited to hear. So I don't know, Zach, do you want to start us off and pull up the slides?
Can do. So hopefully all are able to see the slides.
Yep.
And yeah. Thank you again, everyone, so much for coming to this workshop. We're really, really excited to be able to have this conversation with you all. And we're hopefully and hoping that at the end of this, we can provide a little bit of direction, but most importantly, that we can basically say that we are here to support all of you throughout this process. And Kyle, you've added this slide, so I will let you tackle the contents of this.
So this is not meant to be a seminar on the history, but it's just merely to say that you all have a history, a very long and rich history. This is probably all information you already know, but way back in 1747 was the beginning of a permanent convention of ministers in New Hampshire. It grew over the 19th century. There's many parallels between the way New Hampshire grew and Massachusetts and Connecticut and Rhode Island. You began as a general association, and you had to deal with the fact that the state was no longer going to pay for your churches through compulsory taxation. You took an early and important stand against slavery. Again, this is just the Cliff Notes version. And then by moving into the 20th century, as Congregationalism became a denomination, you continued to grow with it. So the General Association from 1809 became the General Conference in 1914. I put in there the merger of the Congregationalists with the Christian Connection because the Christian Connection was a much smaller denomination, but did merge in 1931, and they had their own conferences within the state of New Hampshire. And so some of those records are already at the Congregational Library, but we're always particularly on the lookout for Christian Connection records because they tend to have not survived as well. 1961, you voted to join the United Church of Christ, and then historically in 2024 decided to form the Granite State Association. So, this history is one that we are actively excited to help promote and interpret. And I think, as I said, you already knew you had a history, but it's a pretty long and rich and important one. And really trying to document that history in all of its richness is what I think drives the conference and what it wants to do, and drives the Congregational Library and what we hope to do. Over to you, Zach.
Yes. Thank you, Kyle. And can I just say, having worked with many churches in our time here at the CLA, we recognize the need to provide guidance and resources to help those working with organizational records. We're so happy to be here over Zoom as part of this workshop, and we hope that we can be a useful resource for you as you begin your transitional work and also begin to work closely with the NHC UCC staff. The image on the screen right now is a shelf in our archives office, and it serves as a sort of holding area for both new collections and collections that are in process. It's a good visualization for the start of this workshop, as it provides an excellent example of the various shapes and sizes of boxes that collections often come into us looking like. While the produce box near the bottom right of this image is certainly not the ideal archival box, it is still a much better solution than, say, keeping files on a floor or scattered around on different shelves in so many different locations. Today's conversation is really just a start to help you think about the management of your association's archives. I want everyone to keep in mind that this will be a fairly brief introduction, and our main goal is to get you thinking about how to engage in records management as part of this transitionary period. We also recognize that this kind of work can appear daunting and scary and, frankly, very mountainous. But we're going to do our best to help demystify the process in our brief time together this evening. Being here is already an excellent first step forwards on your journey to getting these records gathered together and ready for transfer and, most importantly, long-term preservation and access. So, what are association records? Let's start off then by asking the question, what are association records? It's definitely a question that we have been asked before. We've worked with both associations and conferences in the past, and while there are certainly similarities between all of those that we've worked with, that work has also shown us that every association is unique. So the answers we're going to provide tonight towards this question are more or less generalities. And if in the future, if you have questions about specific situations, please feel free to reach out or ask them tonight. But even before I can answer the question that's listed on this slide, I think we should ask, what do we even mean when we say record? Do we mean anything that the association has produced? Do we only mean the administrative records? What does a record even look like physically? Well, in the grandest sense, nearly everything can be considered an association record. When we talk about records, we are talking about documents, information, data, and things created by or received by the association in the course of its normal activities. So, of course, the minutes of the annual meeting are records, as are the monthly financial reports. And so too are the programs and brochures created for events, if they exist. But we want you to think more broadly about what is an association record. Records capture the memory of a moment in time. So yes, when we talk about association records, we are talking about the annual reports, but we're also talking about the photographs taken of that 4th of July association party. We are talking about the video of an installation service for one of your association's ministers. We're talking not only about the records which document the mechanical operation of your association, but also the records which document the history and memory of your association's mission and community. On the screen here is a list of some of the most common types of records which we at the CLA run into when we look at previously acquired association and conference records. Not every association is going to have all of these types of records, but we expect that most associations will have plenty of records similar to those listed here. And this isn't an exhaustive list by any account. Um, Far from it, but we think it's a good place to start as you think about what kinds of records your association has on hand and or has possibly created throughout their storied histories. Remember too that records can look like a lot of different things. They can be loose papers in a manila folder found in a filing cabinet, or they could be bound volumes stored on a shelf, or they could be files stored on a USB drive and stuck to someone's computer right now. Records are the information, the memory, and they're not necessarily defined by their physical characteristics. So think holistically when thinking about what kinds of records your association might have. Now that we've got you all thinking about what records look like, let's move on to a very relevant topic for this evening: records management. I want to start by providing a short definition. Records management is the organization and control over the various items created by your association, and it's a vital component for preserving your mission, knowledge, and history. This includes everything from committee records, ministerial records, correspondence, and so much more. From working the reference desk, those of us at the CLA can tell you firsthand the emotions that people feel when they're able to see their families and friends and relatives found in everything from that photograph of an important event to an ecclesiastical council result from the 18th century to the passing mention of a person in a secretary's notebook. The work you're doing as an association during this transition will not only benefit your community as it exists today, but I promise you that it will be greatly appreciated by people in the future. Conversely, in our role as stewards between records we hold and the people asking about them, nothing is as sad as having to tell someone that the records they are seeking are either missing or gone. To be clear, every organization has its limitations, be it money, time, or personnel. But by being actively involved in the records management process, you are doing much to ensure memory and mission will be long preserved. And this is key, long will be accessible to people. So perhaps contrary to popular understanding, not every record produced is something that needs to be preserved in perpetuity. I've heard this stat, although it's probably apocryphal, that only approximately 10% of an organization's records will be permanently archived. I'm not going to go too deep into what I think about that exact topic, but it is important to note that records management is as much about the preservation of records as it is about the systematic and thoughtful removal and eventually destruction of records. As you begin to gather together your association's records, you are likely going to run into a lot of records, especially those from the last 50 years or so, that may or may not need to be sent to the conference. There are a lot of record types that should, generally, not be kept longer than 7 years. What I've put on this slide are some very generalized guidelines based on record keeping for nonprofits and churches um, about the materials that need to be permanently kept, either by the conference or repository, and the types of materials that largely do not need to be kept after a 7 year period: deeds, administrative records and minutes, IRS determinations, ministerial files especially, appraisals and bequests and insurance documents especially are only some of the things that absolutely need to be kept, if they exist. Meanwhile, contracts with vendors, most records that a bank will have produced, invoices and receipts, and kind of almost anything related to accounts payable, W-2 statements, records related to grants that might have been received, and OSHA documents. These are categories of materials which do not need to be kept longer than 7 years in most cases.
Is this
Uh,
is this slide deck gonna be available to us after?
Yes, it will be.
Okay. All right, thank you.
No problem. Again, these are some very general guidelines, and any final determinations should be made in consultation with conference staff. However, I hope these offer you a useful start to thinking about your records as you gather them, and help you to think about which ones absolutely need to be kept and which ones can be put aside as consideration for removal. So moving towards transition. Now that we have some idea of what records might be and what they might look like and which need to be kept, let's talk about how we may go about managing these records. While records management can be difficult, we do believe that there are some easy first steps that you can take that'll set up your association for success during this transition that do not require huge investments in time, people, or money. The first step, hands down, that we always recommend to any group tackling records and records management and archives is to form some kind of committee. Perhaps even committee is too formal a title for this task, but the primary reason we suggest this as a first step is that more heads will be better than one. In almost every situation involving records, having multiple heads together to think through, to discuss together, and to work together will do a lot. A records committee will ease the workload of any single person. If possible, we always suggest that the committee should have all sorts of different stakeholders on it. A good starting list for stakeholders might include, just as very brief examples, ministerial staff, administrative staff, and volunteers of the association. At this point, too, we always like to say that records management is an ongoing process. Things will move probably slower than you'd like. Problems will take time to resolve, and workflows will take a while to become refined for this process. But that's all very normal. And more importantly, it's okay. The point of the committee and records management isn't to solve issues overnight, but to create an environment conducive to the further preservation of your records after transition. Step 2, gather your records. Next step then would be for the committee to work with the association at large to gather your records. This may be a particularly difficult step as the record-keeping practices of associations may vary wildly between associations. It does make it a little bit harder for us to make generalizations, but I'll attempt anyways. So to start during this phase, you want to figure out where your records currently are. Even if the majority are already in a single space, it's likely that some records are just not going to be there right now. What records are held by your association's community in basements and attics? What records are held separately by former heads or secretaries of the association? Use this time as a committee then to begin reaching out to various stakeholders and previous creators of records and ask them what they may have or even what they may know. This could be considered almost a bit of a research phase, uh, depending on how well record keeping was done in the past. In general, we suggest that all of your records eventually be stored in a single location. Ultimately, eventually, that'll be the conference, but before that, even, we hope that you will gather all of your materials into a single location. Records can take up quite a bit of space, and you want to ensure that you're storing all of yours in a space that will not instantly become overcrowded. I do also want to make mention that it's possible that your association's historic records may already exist at another repository already. Some initial research at the CLA suggests that some associations may have deposited their historic records already, although that doesn't seem to be the case for most. We know here at the CLA we have records from the New Hampshire West Association of Ministers. If in the course of gathering records, you learn that some of your historic records have already been deposited at a museum, library, or archive elsewhere, let us in the conference staff know. It's good that those records may already exist at a repository. That means they're already accessible and kept safe. But it's also will be useful for us at the CLA, at least, to just know where they exist so that when we get questions in the future, we can direct them to the location. And then finally, step 3, let's talk a little bit about what happens after gathering your records. So you've identified a space for all of the records, and you've begun to gather them all into that space. What's next? Well, for us, we would suggest begin organizing and packing those records. As we've talked before, there are likely going to be some types of records that do not need to be kept. Working with the conference, these should likely be sorted out. Once your permanent records have been gathered, you can begin working to pack those records so that they may eventually be brought to the conference, either by a pickup or a drop-off. We would suggest to try to really only schedule something once everything has been gathered. Uh, it, Talking from experience with records, it can become a minor nightmare if there are multiple drop-offs over a protracted amount of time. So it's usually better to wait a little bit longer and gather everything than it is to uh, do things in piecemeal. In terms of packing, we generally suggest banker's boxes, which can generally be purchased at your local Home Depot or Staples. That said, almost any cardboard container will do. Plastic tubs can also work in a pinch as a container for records, but we don't generally recommend those. Uh, Pack boxes tightly, but don't overstuff them. If there is a significant empty space in a box after packing, use a packing material like bubble wrap or those air-filled packing pillows to fill any empty space. Do not ever use packing peanuts or other packing foam with records. They are very staticky and will cling to paper forever. Um, Also, use this time to begin identifying any duplicates you might be finding among your records. Weeding duplicates out of a records collection can save significant space and also just generally make a collection easier to use and understand. So very briefly, some next steps. Once materials are gathered by the conference as a whole, an additional sorting, gathering, and distribution phase will begin. The conference will be maintaining a lot of the modern records, especially those listed here. Meanwhile, the pre-1957 is what we're considering historic records at the moment. And those are the ones which the CLA is interested in working with the NHC UCC to preserve and make accessible long-term, either by depositing them here or working to find another repository, whatever is the ultimate long-term decision. At this point, I'm sure you're all buzzing with ideas and thoughts. I do want to briefly switch gears now and touch upon what the archives here at the CLA does and what professional archiving involves. As library professionals, we provide new collections with professional grade services such as housing of records in climate controlled space and engaging a series of tasks with an eye towards long-term preservation. Preservation includes a series of activities such as rehousing collections into acid-free boxes and folders, identifying items at risk of mold or other issues that may impact sustainability, to the removal of every archivist's greatest nightmare, metal staples. At the end result will be what we call a finding aid, which is basically a detailed inventory so that someone hoping to view a particular collection can get a broad overview of what it contains without having to be there physically. If you are interested, many of our past Church Stewardship Initiative programs, or I should say all of them, are available online. All of the videos are available on our YouTube, and the programs themselves and many of the resources we've handed out are also available on our website under the Church Stewardship Initiative section. These are geared primarily towards churches themselves and the records and management of their own records. However, many of the skills that we've talked about in those programs may be relevant to you as you begin your work with the association. And in general, I also would say, please share them with the churches and ministers in your associations and conference, as we think they are a wonderful resource to share. Some quick takeaways. The mission of the CLA is not to collect every single record from every single congregational organization, but instead to ensure that the story of Congregationalism is preserved and remembered. We are a resource, which we hope you will use to help you in your own missions to keep and preserve records. Even if we do not hold those records, even if we don't hold those records ourselves. We want to work with you to ensure the preservation of records. Before we conclude, I do want to drive a point home. Please do not simply throw out records without checking in with us and the conference. It is far too common for us to hear from churches primarily that have thrown out their oldest records because they did not see the value in them, or they felt it was their only option in cases where a church had to downsize significantly. Nearly all records and the memories contained therein are irreplaceable. Uh, so again, don't undervalue your association records. Those records that may be hiding in an attic, basement, or behind equipment in a closet all tell a story of your community, its values, mission, and history. I sincerely hope that after today, you do not just see a volume taking up space, but instead an artifact that needs protecting and preserving. And Kyle can speak even more about the long history of New Hampshire and the Congregational
I'm
Library
not
and
going to let the
Archives.
history go, guys. So I do love this quote. It's from the minutes of the New Hampshire General Association back right after the Civil War. It was around the time the library was being opened, and just, the long-standing connection between the conference and the library, and that you celebrated the design of our new building. And that you earnestly commended to all the churches and associations to help us collect a full and complete library of congregational history, biography, and literature. So we look forward to that relationship continuing for the next 100+ years. There's 3 things that I just want Zach for us to just sort of emphasize, which you touched on briefly, but I think we could say a little bit more about. First, mold.
Yes.
If you find mold, Zach, tell them what to do.
If you find mold, contact us. Generally speaking, moldy materials probably need to just simply be discarded, unfortunately. Although depending on whether or not how moldy an item could be, or whether or not it even is mold, because there's some things that look like mold that actually aren't, it could be that it's fine. But yeah, generally, if you run into something that you even think is mold, also start wearing gloves and mask up. Molds is no joke.
Yes, we do not want anybody to get ill as a result of doing this work. The second one, many of you probably have digital files. So let's talk a little bit about what to do with digital files, because we certainly don't want to lose the last couple decades of the history of our faith, and they might only exist in electronic form.
Yes. Yeah. Electronic records are very important to keep, assuming that we can. If you have records that are on flash drives or CDs, try to move them onto, or at least copy them onto a secondary device, as those are the ones most likely to be lost to time. If in general, anything that is truly a unique digital object, one that simply has to be kept and what was created as a digital object, should probably be printed out. So for example, you have contract agreements or certain types of insurance or IRS or other types of weird, important, very important organizational records that only exist currently as in a digital format. Those should probably be printed out. Paper is by far the best preservation medium, and something like that is unique and absolutely vital to understanding the sort of organization, or even just the legal status of your organization or your association, should absolutely be printed.
Yeah. But sometimes you'll, digital records will be on completely obsolete format that require a device that most people will no longer have. Like, I'm thinking of my old I have these big old zip
Yeah.
and they're just, they don't, those drives that read them are no longer exist. So, or at least they don't exist so does the library have drives like that they could extract material like that from?
Unfortunately, no. And in fact, we generally avoid collecting certain types of old electronic format materials on such devices because we simply do not have the capacity or technology available to us here to be able to extract information from them.
Well, so this is an interesting thing, right? Because at one point we thought that we were all being good by collecting data in these formats, and now they're completely inaccessible to us.
Yes, it is. It is an unfortunate thing, and I fear archivists had a moment in the past where we thought electronic would be a wonderful preservation format, and in fact, if you go back to 15 or so years, 20 years, we thought of digitization as a method of preservation. Now, if you talk to librarians and archivists, we view digitization only as a means of accessibility. We no longer talk about digitization as a form of preservation because we have come to realize that, yes, relying on mostly certain corporations to continue making the tools and formats necessary to be able to read that data is not the best preservation strategy long term.
So, so I mean, what we're currently using right now, will be obsolete. So so are you suggesting then that um, there's a whole generation of material, like I'm thinking of the material that I have that's in Dropbox, like, um, that's who's to say that in 5 years that's not going to be completely obsolete?
Yeah, it's tricky. Right now, the general guideline is that, especially for things that are like documents, which are most electronic materials, so things that were produced on a word processing system like Word or Google's version of Word, that the current recommendation for those kinds of materials is to save them as PDFs. PDFs are supposed to be the preservation format, and therefore is supposed to be what we use long term. Admittedly, it relies on Adobe, which I think is weird that that is still officially like coming from federal government levels of preservation. Is like the official format is still very weird to me, but that is what we're supposed to do. That said, uh, things stored on systems like Dropbox are generally considered to be relatively stable and safe in at least the short term. Long term, absolutely is going to be a major question of how to do it. And unfortunately, the answer in a lot of cases, and why I said for things that are truly unique, is that the paper is and continues to be the best preservation format. So a lot of things, if we do have digital records that truly are in the world of unique or things that need to be kept long term, the answer we often suggest is if you're concerned about it long term, then should just print it out and put it onto paper.
Okay.
Yeah.
Zach, why don't you take the slides down so we can all see each other?
Yeah, sorry.
So I would follow two things, Mark. I think one, as you're finding those zip drives and those floppy disks, there are other places that have, other consultants that you can use to get the material off of there. So I would say collect them just so that they're a resource for the conference, especially if there are things on there that become uber important. We are, like many other institutions, as you can hear from Zach saying, kind of wrap our head around what to do with the digital. So we've been had conversations with a church down in Virginia that was closing, and their entire archive is digital. They've only been around 20 years, and we were going to use that as a case study. So, we have a digital archive. That's what we're moving towards as a place to store. You think about, all of the conference yearbooks these days are made as PDFs. They're not even printed anymore. So we are recognizing that digital records will be preserved. The challenge that you're hearing here is that we've had paper for 500 years. We've had the digital files for 20 or 30. And so we're doing our best to do that. But I think for the purposes of what you're all doing, gather that material. I think Zach is right that if there are things that are absolutely essential, deeds, insurance policies, and things like that, it's probably best to print them out or let the conference office kind of decide how it wants to handle it. But for me, I would hate to see us lose the last several decades of what these churches and associations have done, because we have just seen it as, kind of ephemeral. Paula, I think you had your hand up.
Yeah, the Merrimack Association has brilliantly taken all their COCM files, and they are all in our box that we have. And we've already gone down to the office, and Sam has complete access to that. But I'm just looking at the registrar's annual reports. They go back digitally on our box till 2008. So
Wow.
everything that we were ever given in paper form was scanned and put into the box. Gordon, you want us to do anything with that? Please say no.
You are muted.
Dang it, I know better than that. I'm not sure I totally wrapped my head around the question, but I think the answer is no. That if we have things, and there are good pieces of this stuff. I don't know about those records in particular, that we've printed out anyway and have in files, so we don't need to be printing out additional copies of them.
Thank you.
Yeah, Mark, please.
So I have a few questions. So one is, Zach, when Zach was going through the presentation, there was a moment when you were talking about not needing multiple copies of the same document. So what that brings to my mind is that you're going to be in a situation where you're going to have two of the same document. And how do you identify which of the versions of it is better? My thought process here is that, like, obviously you want the one without mold, obviously, but so you'd be thinking about the quality of the actual copy itself. But I was wondering, like, if somebody wrote a marginalia in one or something like that, that would strike me as being more interesting, to be kept. And so I'm just wondering if there are some thoughts you want to give about the decision-making process of deciding which copy to keep.
That's a really, really good question. Yeah. A lot of the time when we think, or at least when I think of duplicate materials, I think of like two copies of the same program for an event, where they are identical in all ways, shape, and forms. If we also have a program that has some marginalia on it, we often think of that as now a different, unique item, separate from the programs overall, that there might be 50 copies in a collection. So I think that if you have copies and one is like a clean, corrected, perfect, what came off the printer and looks beautiful version, and you also have one that has a bunch of marginalia on it, I would say keep both of those and think of them as unique materials.
Excellent. Yeah. Especially the ones that, were notated by Martin Luther King in my church. I think those ones I definitely want to keep.
Oh, yes.
So my second question is, trying to discern the difference between materials that are significant with respect to the association and materials that are significant with respect to an individual church, and how to define that difference. Because it strikes me that perhaps depending on the church, or depending on the circumstance or the historical moment, some some documents that are specific to a church might, might be significant and important to think of in this regard. So I'm trying to discern the difference between materials that are significant for a church and for materials that are significant on the association level.
Yeah, that's a good question. I imagine in some cases it might just be bringing individual examples and to either us or the conference and asking. In general, I would say records that were produced primarily by the church, if it's still active, should be kept with the church. And then documents produced primarily by the association or conference are probably what ultimately will be kept by the conference. Sometimes it can be hard to make a determination depending on how closely individual churches were with associations. I know I've definitely run into pasts where like some associations in Massachusetts essentially ran out of a single church, and there's definitely some overlap between what was written in the church records and what was written in the association records. And sometimes when that has happened, the determination has ultimately been like, what does the book purport to be it is? Well, oftentimes some of these, especially older records, they'll have a title page that someone's written and that these are the records of the Merrimack Association, or these are the records of First Church in Fitchburg. That's not always going to be the case. So it sometimes it comes down to gut instinct whether or not something is a church record versus an association record in those very unique instances.
I mean, I think as a rule of thumb for everyone on here, when in doubt, just save it, and that
Yes.
you're the collection, the materials you're gathering, you go through up to potentially 2 reviews, right? The first review is through the conference. That's going to go through the materials and figure out the things that it needs from, a legal, financial standpoint. And then for things that they recognize might have more historic import, or they just don't know what to do with, but no, they don't need to keep, they can come to the library. In many ways, it's just sometimes you just need to see the entire swath of things to kind of understand, okay, well, New Hampshire associations worked in this way, or this association worked in this way. And that central to its history was that it always did this sort of thing. I would say that it's not uncommon that for associations to become the repositories for churches that closed. And some of you might encounter that. In that case, generally what we do is, and we're doing this with the Rhode Island Conference right now, they gave a bunch of material in 1984, and it was one big collection. And it was basically, if you were trying to use it, you'd have all the conference records, and then there's several other boxes that are just like, here's a folder for this church, and here's a folder for another. That sat that way. We're now moving towards actually pulling those out and making a separate file for each church. That's the work that we do. That's not work that you all have to do. I would encourage you, unless you have a strong love of closed church records in your personal library, to just send them to the conference and then send them along to us. We can also help out. So say, Mark, say you had 2 closed churches and you weren't sure if there was material that had gone to the local historical society or gone to someplace else that completed that. We can help out with that. It's pretty common for archivists to hop on the phone and just talk to each other. So does that help? I hope we're kind of getting at your question there.
Yeah, and unfortunately, I still have some more questions.
Sure, go.
Yeah. So as a pastor, I was a little sad to see that the word sermon never showed up on any of those lists. And is that because sermons are kind of specific to churches, and so as a result wouldn't be specifically interesting for conferences? Or is it I mean, I presume that sermons would be interesting historically.
Yes, we have actually probably one of the largest sermon, both print and manuscript collections in the Northeast. Yes, it's not here because typically we don't see sermon records within association and conference records. We see them much more often in either church records or even in the records of individual ministers themselves. So yes, that's why it was not brought up on the slides here.
But we do love to see them, and we love to
Yes.
receive them. And, you know, so we got a collection from, was it the Gardner one that had a wooden
Yep.
box that had a decade's worth of hand-typed sermons from one minister, and to have that view into how in that community that minister was navigating, you know, an interwar period, fantastic.
I
So
have, in my office in Jaffrey, I have every sermon for 20 years that M. Preston wrote, and they're just in bankers boxes, and so that covers like from like the, you know, the early 80s all the way through. Yeah, so things like that are important. All
Yeah.
right,
Yes.
so my final question, there are going to be some things like that that go across associations, right? Like I'm thinking of my Sacred Ally quilt stuff, which went across multiple associations. And so those things are going to be significant too, I would think, in some.
Yep.
Absolutely. And, you know, one way to kind of think about it, the collections that you see in, if you go into our catalog and type in, the collections usually are shaped by who gave them. So you will see we have the Rockingham Christian Connection, and we have a Grafton Orange collection, and we have a Piscataqua collection. And those are because they were given by somebody from that organization. Here, you have 7 associations that are kind of working together. So what in fact might be, if there's a lot of material that cuts across, the historic components might either be separated out, or they might just be a collection that says, look, they are so intertwined that you need to treat them as an organic body. And generally Zach and Billy, the other archivist, are the one who try to make that call. If you do damage to the history and make it incomprehensible by pulling it apart, you leave it together.
Yep.
Thank you.
Yep.
Thank you for your questions. Very good ones.
So we did have Sarah send around that survey, I think probably yesterday. I'm sort of curious from folks up here. You know, the first question is, you know, kind of, I feel very confident. I know where all the records are and they're organized as one end of the spectrum. And then the other end was, it's a mess. I don't know where things are. I'm kind of curious where, and I know those are far polls, but how are people feeling at this point? Do you feel like you kind of know where everything is, or are you feeling a little daunted by by the work ahead?
I felt really good before this meeting.
Oh no, that's the opposite way we want.
Because I was so proud that we had all ours in box, but I just actually got an email today that someone found conflicting stuff in their house. So I haven't even asked people what's sitting in their house yet. So I will do that tomorrow.
Thank you.
We had what we thought to be the entire collection of records in a locked file cabinet in Keene, and we had lost the key to that cabinet, which was wonderful. But then apparently it showed up. The key showed up again. So now all of those files are in 3 bankers boxes, which are in currently in Stacy Colgren's office in Marlborough, waiting for us to cull them, waiting for Stacy Colgren to cull them, and I will help her.
Great.
That's awesome.
I think I have the majority of the paper files in my office in the church. I'm daunted about bringing electronic files to box, and now I'm not even sure if I should do that because of what you just said. Should I just print them out and put them in the other stuff?
And I think there are ways, because one, you could just start printing everything, right? And you could be there forever, and a lot of trees could pass away as a result. I mean, I think that we're very happy to work with the conference staff, and what Sarah and Gordon, you might want to do is, just create kind of a Dropbox or a OneDrive or Box or whatever you use, and have people put the stuff in there, and then we could provide some guidance, or you guys could kind of pick out what you need. I feel at this point it's more about just kind of gathering the information. But Gordon, you're gonna talk.
So Tara, I think there's no, I did get it unmuted. Sorry. I think there's two kind of simultaneous things going on here. There is saving the history piece, but for things that we actively use, we also need ease of access, and so that means we actually want the digital files. Because if we need to look something up, it is much quicker for us to do that than go through 7 Rockingham Association boxes to try to find it. I would say it's a both and, not an either or.
I would
Great.
say particularly for ministerial files, that is one where if you have those digitized already, please put them in Box. We use those all the time for transfers of standing and etc. Those are going to be really important for us to have digital.
Because reality is probably what will happen is we'd have to then take it and rescan it all anyways, and we don't want to have to do that work if you already have it in digital.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. And I think it's worth underscoring here that we're so happy to have a seat at the table, but this is first and foremost the gathering of organizational records for active organizations, right? So use that as your guide point first. It's what the conference needs. And then we are working here for things that the conference determines are not the things that it needs to keep. So don't be driven kind of by first and foremost what you think is, should be in Boston, but what should be in your conference office.
And I'm sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, I'm the treasurer of the Rockingham Association, so I've already talked to Lydia about how to transfer things financially and documents and everything to be able to get to her. And because I've only been the treasurer for a couple of years, everything is electronic.
Sure.
So.
Yeah, makes sense.
Methodologically, like one of the things I'm kind of hearing from you folks, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that as we're going through the process of culling these materials, basically, I think that our MO should be to, if we have a question about it, then save it and send it to you folks. So very, very, I'm imagining that very few things will actually be put in the shredder. That for the most part, if it has value for the conference, it goes to the conference. If it doesn't have value for the conference and we're wondering whether it has historic value, then it goes to you and you guys decide, essentially.
That's fine with us. Yeah, that's
a good
often.
summation.
I was going to say, Zach, do you want to talk a little bit about how collections often shrink when they come in here?
Yes, one of an archivist's jobs is to look at a collection and pull out the materials, describe the materials, but also pull out the materials that have little to no historic value. Again, a lot of that is a lot of what we see with the church records that we see, which is what I primarily work with a lot, is kind of these modern financial records that are produced in the course of normal banking and financial transactions. Like a lot of things like that I will pull out of a collection are just receipts or invoices from vendors. Those are the kinds of things that we don't collect, and is pretty specifically a part of our collecting policy of what we don't collect. So yep, many a collection once it arrives here does in fact shrink. And it's not entirely just because we also play Tetris with our materials in the stacks.
I was going to add, Mark, I think the one place where culling could be really helpful, because I know we have some files like this. If you have 22 copies of the same ordination paper.
Hmm.
One will do us. Because sometimes you see everybody just like put that stuff together and put it in the folder, and then you're like, oh, well, goodness, we don't need all of that. So,
Except for the ordination paper, you need all of those.
okay, I will concede. And it's perfectly fine to give us a box that has a big question mark on it.
Mhm.
Thanks,
This has been
everybody.
super helpful.
Good. Oh, I'm so
Yay.
glad. Wonderful. Any final questions as we kind of wrap things up for this evening?
How are we going to get that PowerPoint? Can you
It's
send it
Green
out?
box.
already sent. Kyle sent it when we were in the meeting.
Oh, awesome.
So
You
thanks to
rock.
Kyle for that. And Kyle, you wanted us to kind of fill in those surveys even after the fact, right? That would be helpful for you all.
Yes.
So if you haven't done that yet, and folks should send those directly to you, is that right?
Or they can send them to you. I mean, I want it
Okay.
to be sort of a resource for, you and Gordon and Zach and I to be able to use. Those are just a chance for you to kind of say, here are the things that we're seeing. That helps us kind of understand, and looking at it quickly, like, okay, this is what we should expect. But it also use that, mark it up if you're like, gee, there's a gap here from 2014 to 2019. Is that a problem? And then, which obviously probably is, yes, that's a problem. But
Great. And then what we'll do is try to have this on our website for folks to reference as a tool in their, work with this. And it might be on the Congregational Library website as well.
Yep.
Wonderful. Well, thanks everybody for coming, and
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
it was really neat to see that date and that quote. I'm so glad you put that in there. It's wonderful that we've been, collaborating for that long.
It's great. Yeah. And we're very excited to see what this exercise or what this work pulls forward. What kind of treasures you might find that you didn't know you had, or that, or that it might now nicely be contextualized, and seeing with others. So, and, we'll keep doing the work of trying to figure out if there are other historic records in places, because you might really want to know, that the Portsmouth Athenaeum, for example, has X, or that New Hampshire Historical Society has Y. I think it'd be great at the end of the process to have a real roadmap, for where everything is located.
How is it good? How is the material going to physically get down to you eventually? Are you going to come pick it up, or are we going to drive it down there? How's that going to work?
We'll be coordinating with Sarah and Gordon, so I think it'll all go through the conference office. But everybody on this screen, of course, is welcome to come down for a behind-the-scenes tour, or to see the place. I know, Mark, you've been there before, but come back down. We'd love to show you what we do in person.
Maybe we can make a field trip of it.
That'd be fun.
Kyle reminded me of something from one of the comments earlier that I wanted to circle back to. And those who've been around me a long time know that I say this about several things. But as we collect all these records, the only way this will ever happen is imperfectly. And if you find some new set of records 2 years from now, just let us know. That's okay. We're not, we'll deal with that then. As much as we can get right now, that's helpful. And I totally expect that there's going to be some box found on somebody's porch in the future, and we'll tackle that then.
Yeah.
Well, thanks again, everybody, particularly to Zachary and Kyle. We'll be in touch. And to other folks, don't hesitate to reach out if you have more questions.
Both mine and Kyle's email are on the slides and at the end, so please always feel free to reach out to us. We are a resource, and we are happy to help.
Have a good night, everybody.
Take care.
Have a good evening.